absolutely superb.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a specific policy, Healthy Start vouchers, which were implemented in the UK in 2006. And the main aim of these policies was to increase fruit and veg consumption among low-income families. So the way the policies worked is partly through economic incentives, but I think when they were introduced and given other evidence on the effect of this type of policy, there's kind of some reason for thinking that there might have been wider behavioural effects. So what we do in this paper is look sort of first at whether the policy worked, and then also try to understand the mechanisms through which it worked. So the kind of the policy question that we're interested in is kind of growing concern over rising obesity rates and kind of poor diets among many households. For policymakers, there are a number of options. So they could go for standard economic incentives such as taxes or subsidies, and a number of policies have been implemented in different countries. There's also the option of kind of information campaigns if you think that poor dietary choices are the result of a lack of information. And in the UK, there was the kind of well-known 5 a day campaign, which was trying to kind of raise levels of fruit and veg consumption through a kind of information campaign. And there's also been a suggestion that we could kind of implement behavioural nudges. And there's a lots of small-scale evidence showing that these type of nudges, so changing the kind of presentation of information and choices to people, might also have an effect. As I said, we're looking at targeted benefits. So we're looking at the UK Healthy Start scheme, which was intended to increase fruit and veg consumption. It's also relevant because in the US, the kind of a major part of welfare is food stamps or SNAP. And there have been some suggestions that SNAP could be kind of reformed in order to target food choices more on healthier options. So we feel our paper is relevant to kind of that debate as well. So the way targeted benefits work, they have clear economic incentive effects for distorted consumers, and you'd expect to see a big increase in consumption among that group. There's recent evidence that suggests that this kind of targeted benefit or labelled benefit might also have wider labelling effects. So this is a kind of behavioural response where people respond other than in line purely with the economic incentive effects, and just kind of giving someone a voucher might change the way they behave or consume because it changes the kind of salience of the good, or it provides some kind of signalling value. And there's been a number of papers which suggest that these type of labelling effects are important in practice. And if these labelling effects are important, then it kind of suggests that targeted vouchers could be a more powerful policy tool for achieving the desired change in fruit and veg consumption, because the effects would be kind of wider than just for the distorted consumers, and they could actually work on kind of all households. And that's kind of really what we're interested in. Okay, so what we do in this paper, we look at the UK Healthy Start scheme, which was introduced in 2006. If you're not aware of it, I mean, it's kind of not a major part of UK government sort of welfare provision. It's quite targeted vouchers for low-income families that they could use to buy fruit, veg, and milk. And it was sort of specifically for low-income families on benefits who had children who are 4 or under, and for pregnant women. So we're going to look at 2 issues. So first of all, we're interested in kind of whether the scheme worked and how much of a change it brought about in fruit and veg consumption among the recipient households. And then we're also interested in how it worked. So we can kind of understand these sort of specific economic incentive effects of targeted vouchers that would work primarily on distorted households. But then we're also interested in whether there's any evidence of wider labelling effects. So is this type of policy potentially a more powerful tool for shifting behaviour other than just among distorted households? So to give you our conclusions, so we find that the policy worked. It increased fruit and veg consumption among recipient households roughly by 3/4 of a portion a day, if you're thinking about the sort of intention to treat effects, which is, fairly sizable. But what we find, we think, is fairly convincing evidence that the effect was purely driven by distorted households. So the recipient household responded to the underlying economic incentive effects without there being evidence of kind of any wider labelling effects, which we kind of think is interesting because there's reason to believe that, these households might have responded to those other behavioural effects of the policy. So this paper is related to a number of different literatures. There's a literature on food stamps, which actually is kind of similar to us in showing that people respond to food stamps in a way that you'd expect given sort of standard economic incentive effects. It's obviously related to the papers which show that labelling and targeting can have wider behavioural effects. And one of the really interesting questions about this is why labelling kind of seems important in one context and not in others. And it's also relevant to kind of a sort of set of papers which have shown the potential for information campaigns and for nudges. And there some of the evidence is mixed, so there's sort of perhaps limited effectiveness of information, and then nudges kind of yes, but in sort of smaller contexts. So the Healthy Start scheme was introduced in November 2006. It provides vouchers for low-income families, so families that receive benefits, and they can spend the vouchers on fruit and vegetable and milk. It was originally intended just to be spent on fresh fruit and veg, but then increased it to kind of frozen from 2011. The value of the vouchers is relatively small. I mean, it's £3 per voucher per week. You have 1 voucher for each child and 2 vouchers if you have a child aged 0 to 1. The take-up of the policy was relatively high. So 79 to 80% of all eligible families received the vouchers, and most of the value of the vouchers was spent. And you can there's a kind of wide range of different types of shops where you can spend the vouchers, so supermarkets, local corner shops. There also wasn't much evidence of abuse of this scheme, so its kind of implementation seemed to work pretty well. The way we think the labelling effects might work is in sort of the following. So first of all, these kind of vouchers were given a very prescriptive label, so they were called, Healthy Start vouchers to kind of emphasize that they were for giving kids a healthy start in life through a good diet. The way the scheme was implemented was it was kind of rolled out through the existing system of ante and postnatal care. So when you're pregnant in the UK, you get to meet with a midwife roughly 8 or 10 times when you're pregnant. You also get home visits from a healthcare visitor, and they were the people who were responsible for signing up eligible families. And you had to have your application countersigned by one of these health professionals. So you were getting this benefit from a person who was a kind of recognised healthcare professional, which might have expected to kind of give this policy some additional kind of healthy eating sort of connotations. It's always hard to know what governments are kind of anticipating when they implement policies, but this quote here is intended to show that the government may have been expecting these kind of wider labelling effects to be present. The government said they wanted the families to use the vouchers for the benefit of their children, as opposed to seeing it simply as financial support. Okay, so I'll just go quickly through the kind of different ways in which we expect this scheme to work. So what the effect of the vouchers does is to kind of introduce this kink in households' budget constraints. There's a set of consumers or households who are distorted, so they typically don't spend very much money on fruit and veg. For them, the introduction of the vouchers has a sort of powerful effect on their consumption of fruit and veg, shifting to the corner point, and the effect of giving them the vouchers would be greater than if you simply gave them cash. They spend more on fruit and veg than if you gave them cash. But then there's this other group of consumers, the inframarginal consumers. So these are people who would spend more than the value of vouchers if you gave them cash, and for this group, the effect of giving the vouchers is equivalent to giving them cash. So they're better off because they get income, but they're not increasing their fruit and veg by as much as if they're kind of distorted consumers. It's a bit sort of funny kind of imposing labelling effects on a sort of standard economic diagram, but how we think kind of labelling effects work is kind of a bigger shift in fruit and veg consumption among kind of both types of consumers. So labelling effects, I mean, it's sort of quite imprecisely defined, but it's this sort of idea that a voucher increases the salience of the good that it's kind of intended to be purchased with, or it sends kind of a signal about the desirability of these types of purchases. The way we think it works is to kind of shift spending on fruit and veg among both types of households, so distorted and inframarginal, and lead to a bigger increase in spending than if you just gave them cash. So this is kind of what we test. So we're going to kind of define groups of distorted inframarginal consumers, and then we're going to compare the effect of the Healthy Start vouchers with the effect of cash. And we have some kind of clear predictions for teasing apart the behavioural and the behavioural from the standard economic incentive effects. So if it's the economic incentives working, then we expect the Healthy Start vouchers to have a bigger effect on consumption of fruit and veg than just giving cash. Whereas if there are labelling effects, we'd expect, and then if it's the economic incentives, then we expect for the inframarginal consumers, that the effect of the vouchers is the same as just giving them cash. Whereas if there are labelling effects, we kind of expect bigger effects in cash for both groups. So that's kind of what we go on to test with the data. Our identification strategies are triple differences. So we're going to be looking at the effect of the reform. We're going to look before and after the reform. We're going to compare eligible and ineligible households. So eligible and ineligible is purely based on the age of the children. So it's not whether you receive benefits or not. It's all the households in our sample receive benefits, and the eligible households are those whose children kind of fall within the eligible age. So it's sort of 3 months pregnant to your youngest child hitting 4, whereas the ineligible are those with older children. And they're also going to compare distorted and inframarginal households based on their pre-reform levels of spending. So we had distorted households are those who basically spend less than the values of the vouchers on sort of milk, fruit and veg. We're going to look both at a kind of binary treatment effect, so what was the effect of the Healthy Start vouchers, and they're also going to look at a per pound sort of voucher effect, so then we can compare the voucher effect with the effect of cash. In both cases, it's sort of intention to treat effect based on this kind of eligibility measure. We use the household scanner data, which is very detailed. It's a panel, so we can follow households over time, include household fixed effects, and this also allows us to identify distorted and inframarginal consumers based on their pre-reform levels of spending. There's a lot of numbers here. So the main takeaway from this, so we're comparing kind of distorted and inframarginal, and we're comparing eligible and ineligible based on the age of the children. So the main point here is that there are some differences in these types of households, so the eligible and ineligible, the distorted and inframarginal, but we're using a kind of differences in differences, and the key thing is there's no significant differences in characteristics across the distorted and inframarginal eligible and the distorted and inframarginal ineligible. So that's sort of reassuring for our identification strategy. So here are our main results. So we've got kind of, we're looking at the outcome in terms of log spending on fruit and veg, and also the quantity of fruit and veg that's purchased. So the first column, so I've highlighted for both sets of results, gives the kind of the pure binary intention to treat effect pooling across both distorted and inframarginal households. So it shows that the introduction of the policy is associated with a significant increase in spending, both in terms of the money and the quantity of fruit and veg that's purchased. The effect is around 16% in terms of spending and 1.8 kilos. So that gives you the sort of roughly three quarters of a portion for these affected households. The second column then basically contrasts the response among the distorted and the inframarginal consumers. So what this shows is that all of the response is driven by the distorted consumers. There's no significant increase in spending among the inframarginal households, those who are spending more than the value of the vouchers before the reform. And that's obviously both in spending and quantity. We then move on and kind of estimate the effect per pound of voucher. We can control for the income increase, and we compare the response per pound of voucher with the response to a kind of a pound of extra cash. So we're using total spending rather than income, and in the paper we have a number of different specifications for thinking about the overall effect of income. So again, it's reinforcing the results. It's showing that for the distorted consumers, they're significantly more likely to spend out of Healthy Start vouchers on fruit and veg, but for inframarginal, there's no significant difference in how they spend Healthy Start vouchers relative to an increase in cash. So these results are exactly in line with the economic incentive effects, and they're not what we'd expect if there were wider labelling effects of this policy, which might be expected to affect both distorted and inframarginal consumers. Okay, so in the paper we do a number of robustness checks, sort of standard in sort of this type of analysis. We've done a placebo reform, a falsification test, numerous functional forms sort of specifications, and this finding is sort of really robust to various sort of definitional changes and alternative specifications. So this is what we think our evidence shows. Little evidence of any labelling effects for these inframarginal consumers, a response to this policy which is in line with the standard economic incentive effects. So one possibility is that the inframarginal consumers might have interpreted the Healthy Start voucher as a signal about how much they should have been spending. So these were the guys who were pretty much spending the value of the vouchers anyway. So they might have said, okay, I'm eating a healthy level, I don't need to respond. So that's possible, but at the same time, there was this massive healthy, sort of wider healthy eating campaign around the sort of 5 a day. And it's important to note that among inframarginal consumers, yes, they were consuming more than the distorted consumers, but only 3% were purchasing 5 portions of fruit and veg a day. So they're not really eating a lot of fruit and veg, they're just eating slightly more than the distorted. The other possibility is that, we know behavioural biases work on particular types of consumers more than others. So is it possible that inframarginal consumers differ in terms of, the way they take decisions or, other sort of psychological characteristics? So one of the nice things about our data is it has a whole barrage of questions which kind of uncovers attitudes and dispositions and kind of factors which might reflect sort of behavioural characteristics. So there's probably too much information to see here, but the bottom line is the sort of the final column, which is the p-value for the difference across the distorted and inframarginal. And basically for all these kind of different sort of responses, once I find a brand I like, I tend to stick to it. I decide which brands to buy before I go shopping. These kind of indicators of behavioural characteristics, these two types of consumers are actually the same. So I don't think it's the case that one group is more susceptible to behavioural influences than another. Okay, so the findings from our analysis are very much that the Healthy Start voucher had an effect but operated through standard economic incentive effects without any kind of wider labelling. So, for policymakers, the sort of key takeaway is that the policy was effective, it worked, but it didn't work quite as cost effectively as it could have done if the labelling effects had worked. The nice thing about the labelling effects is they would have made this policy even more effective because they would have induced a response among the inframarginals. Whereas in fact, the scheme worked on 60% of recipients, and then the rest for the inframarginals is in some sense a dead weight cost with regard to the policymakers' objectives, which was increasing fruit and veg consumption. The distorted consumers are those most in need of increasing fruit and veg because they were consuming less before, but still it would have been nice if the inframarginals had responded too from a policymaker's perspective. And the implications for nudge, well, I think this is really interesting to think of in the context of this wider debate on labelling effects. And we need to understand more about when label effects are important and when they aren't, and when nudges work and when they might not. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. Incredibly complex time. So as I said at the beginning, we're going to have 3 talks and 2 discussions, so we'll keep questions to the end, otherwise it's rather unfair on the discussants. So I'd like to ask Imran and Rasul now to present what I'm sure is also a very excellent paper.
All right, I'm defeated by technology. I guess, can you hear me? Okay, fine. So the paper I'm going to present today is follows on from sort of a topic that's interested me for a long time, which is try to understand what motivates individuals to behave in pro-social ways. And so the paper I'm going to talk about today looks at a particular dimension, which is why individuals comply with their taxes. So we start with a puzzle, which is in public finance is known as the tax compliance puzzle, that says if we take our standard models of why individuals should comply with taxes, let's say the Becker framework that was laid out a few decades ago, or the Allingham-Sandmo model from the 1970s, those predict that there should be relatively low levels of compliance given low audit probabilities or low penalties. And so that may well characterize the income tax system or many formal tax systems that we observe. And yet when we look at the evidence from around the world, we tend to see very high rates of compliance in modern tax systems, despite those very low audit probabilities and penalties. And in order to reconcile behavior, just matching the standard model to what we observe in data, would require levels of risk aversion orders of magnitude higher than we typically find in most other parts of economics. So the literature has proposed a number of different ways to close this gap between theory and evidence. The first one is a series of papers written primarily by my co-author Henrik Kleven, looking at the importance of third-party information, essentially reducing, creating large detection probabilities. And so the tax compliance puzzle is somewhat solved if you think about those as being the relevant probabilities. There's another class of literature that focuses on the misperception of enforcement parameters and says that people may not understand the true levels of the likelihood that they're going to be audited or penalties conditional on being audited. And the third class of literature to try to close this gap between the theory and evidence focuses on social incentives and psychological motives for why individuals may behave well, absent economic incentives to do so. And so the paper that I'm going to present is going to be a field experiment that really tries to look at the second and third motives in a particular setting that I'll describe in a second. So here what we're going to try to think about is the relative importance of economic and social incentives in driving people's tax compliance behavior. So when I talk about economic incentives, what we're going to try to vary in this context is the penalties, the audit probabilities that individuals face. And social incentives in the literature, or non-pecuniary incentives, have come under a wide range of labels. You might think that it's important for your good behavior to be recognized by other individuals. People may have a sense of duty, there may be norms in place, there may be notions of guilt and shame that also drive individuals' behavior along these non-pecuniary dimensions. And so some of those we'll be able to try to measure in this particular setting and compare and contrast to the responses on the deterrence margin. But studying these social incentives is typically very difficult in the field. We often find it difficult to measure the extent to which these social incentives exist, and also trying to understand and find contexts in which they vary. And so what we're going to do is set up a natural field experiment that allows us to introduce experimental variation in the social incentives that individuals face, and compare and contrast those to elasticities of behavior with regards to tax compliance when we change deterrence parameters in an exogenous way. Okay, so what we're going to study is a context of a local church tax that exists in Germany. This form of taxation exists in a number of different countries. In Germany, it has a long history of existing, and we think this tax system is somewhat salient in individuals' minds. So let me just highlight some key features of this tax system, which are going to be relevant for our analysis. The first is that it's a legal obligation for individuals to pay this church tax. This condition on you being a member of the church, and I'll describe sort of how membership works on a few slides' time. In this tax system, it's also possible to overpay your tax obligations, and overpayments are somewhat encouraged by the church, and those will be represent donations. So you can see just that element of the tax system. It combines some notions of a formal tax system that we're used to studying, as well as some notions of charitable giving. So we're really going to lie in between that space of charitable giving and tax compliance. So you might think about this as some form of voluntary taxation. It is a legal requirement for you to pay, but there's going to be other elements that make it more akin to charitable giving. The second key feature is the true tax base is going to be observable. The tax base on which this tax is based is your actual reported taxable income for the income tax, and that's going to be observed in administrative data, which we're going to match up with church tax payments. That's going to allow us to distinguish a particular typology of individuals in our sample. We're going to be able to distinguish people that we're going to classify as evaders, compliers, and donors based on their pre-treatment behaviors in the context of the same church tax. And the third key feature is going to be that in this church tax system, although it's a legal obligation for people to pay this tax, there's effectively going to be close to zero deterrence in the baseline. The church never decides to match up people's tax payments vis-a-vis the actual administrative records on income taxes. So we think that at baseline, the audit probabilities are approximately equal to zero, and I'll show you some evidence on that at the start of the result. So baseline compliance in this setting, when audit probabilities are close to zero, are essentially going to be driven by people's social concerns or social motivations. And there may be some degree of misperception here that varies across these individual types, and we'll have a particular treatment that tries to parse out the extent to which people may misperceive some key deterrence parameters in this setting. So in the baseline, in which the audit probabilities are going to be close to zero, that's actually, we're going to use that to reveal people's underlying motivation. We're going to think about individuals that evade this tax at baseline. We're going to describe those individuals as predominantly being economically motivated. They choose not to pay because they know that there's going to be no enforcement. We're going to think about another group of individuals as being described as baseline compliers, and these individuals pay exactly what is due under the baseline. We're going to think of those individuals as being socially motivated to some extent. They're not being driven, their behavior is not primarily being driven by the fact that they know they're going to be audited with some strictly positive probability. And then there's going to be a third type of individual who's going to be characterized as a baseline donor, and those are individuals who, pre-treatment, decide to pay more than their legal obligation, so effectively donate some strictly positive amount to this tax. We have panel data on individuals, tracing them for 4 years pre-treatment, and what we observe is that compliance types are very persistent. Individuals who are evading typically evade year to year. Individuals who are donating also tend to donate year to year. So we're going to define your pre-treatment type just based on your actual behaviors in the year prior to the field experiment. Okay? And of course, each of these types could be subject to some form of misperception. They may misunderstand that in the baseline there is actually zero deterrence. And so, as I said, we're going to have one particular treatment that makes it absolutely explicit to this group of individuals that P is actually equal to zero. There's no likelihood that they're going to be audited. And so that's going to allow us to fine-tune our interpretation, separate out notions of misperception from underlying notions of social motivation that might be driving behavior in the baseline. In the paper, we have a simple model that tries to make some predictions about how individuals will respond to our experimental variation in deterrence parameters and some of the social incentives that we provide. I'm not going to go through the model, but I just wanted to highlight some of the key elements in the model. This is essentially just a unification of the standard Becker-Allingham-Sandmo model, which emphasizes individual behavior in response to economic incentives, vis-a-vis something that's quite common in the charitable giving literature, which is the Andreoni model of warm glow, where people obtain some utility from having contributed towards the social good. The nice thing about the model is that we assume that everybody has some element of economic as well as social motives. What differs across individuals is the marginal rate of substitution between these two motives. And so at any given set of parameters, some individuals will be observed behaving predominantly based on economic motives. Other individuals will be their behavior will be predicted primarily based on social incentives. And so around that existing equilibrium is what we're trying to shock these two types of parameters, the economic incentives and the social incentives. And so the model allows for the coexistence of these three types of individual, depending on their marginal rate of substitution between these two drivers of behavior. And so the model generates type-specific predictions on both the extensive margin, whether you pay anything at all, as well as the intensive margin, the extent to which you pay conditional on payment. Let me just give you a few other details of the tax, the data, and then I'll run through the results. So, as I said, this is a local church tax based in Germany. This is, it's a compulsory tax. There is a legal requirement for individuals who are liable for the tax for them to pay. You become liable for the tax once you're 18 years of age. Membership into the church tax is by baptism, and it's always possible for individuals to quit the church and therefore not be liable for the tax anymore. And about 60% of the population of the area we study are actually members of this tax. So the behavior is not focused on individuals who are regular attendees of the church. These are individuals who their parents baptized them into church a generation ago. And as I said, overpayments within this system are somewhat encouraged, and we're going to define them as donations, and that's what's going to lead to this third type of individual existing, which are the baseline donors, that we typically wouldn't observe in an income tax system where overpayments are refunded. So our focus is going to be a sample of individuals who are liable for this church tax, who are Protestant church members who reside in a large metropolitan area in Bavaria. Obviously, there's going to be issues of external validity here, so there's a discussion of this in the paper. In terms of how representative is this sample of all taxpayers in Germany, for example. They're quite similar on observable dimensions that we can see. as well as for the possibility of individuals to evade or contribute to this tax outside of the formal tax system. There may be other mechanisms by which individuals can contribute to the church, and we have a little bit of evidence in the paper looking at whether those types of contributions are complements or substitutes to the formal taxes that we're going to pick up here. The tax schedule is progressive, but you can see 2 points to note here. First, sort of the quantities of individual tax liabilities are more akin to charitable giving. We're talking about you're liable to pay between 0 and 100 euros. But the extent to which your tax duty falls depends on your taxable income. Remember, this is what you report to the tax authorities as being your income, which is what's relevant for the income tax. And so we observe a wide distribution of taxable incomes in our sample. These are not, these are top coded at 500,000 euros, and all the results I'm going to present to you are not heterogeneous depending on the income bracket in which people are. So we think of the margins that I'm going to pick up as applying somewhat similarly to rich and poor individuals. Okay, so the way we ran our experiment was to manipulate the design of the official tax notification that individuals receive in order to pay this tax. So typically this tax notification is a couple of pages long, and so what we did was experimentally vary the tax notification on a number of different dimensions. The first dimension was just to simplify this tax notification, to make it more salient that this was legally required for you to pay this tax, and to make very salient to individuals the various tax bins that they would be in. We know from other parts of the literature, both in terms of lab and field settings, that tax complexity often drives people's behavior in the tax and benefit system. And so we wanted to look at the pure effects of simplification per se, as well as changing some of the other margins that I'm going to come to now. So the second class of treatment was a zero deterrence treatment, which is designed to capture the extent to which people may misperceive the true baseline audit probability. So there we made it absolutely explicit that your likelihood to be audited was 0. And then we have a class of treatments which induce positive deterrence into the system by experimentally varying the likelihood that you're going to be audited. And I think the audit probabilities were 10%, 20%, and 50%. We also have an audit probability notch system, which was communicated in one of the tax letters, which tries to replicate the Sanchez and Sobel sort of optimal tax design that says the audit probability will be at a level, at a threshold level, depending on your tax payment. And the other class of treatments that I'm going to focus on provide individuals with experimental variation in their social incentives. And the way we're going to try to manipulate that is by offering individuals either social or monetary rewards for them having complied and paid their taxes. The social reward is going to be of the form your name could come in a local newspaper, and the monetary reward is going to be you're going to be entered into some prize draw where you can obtain some payoff. I'm going to bunch all of those together and think about those as trying to emphasize the rewards for compliance that individuals receive and see whether that changes behavior. This is going to be in the same setting in which we vary the deterrence rewards, and to start with I'm going to look at the effects of misperception and reducing the complexity of the system. Samples are balanced across these various treatments, and all the treatments were truthfully implemented. We do have another class of treatments that were part of the field experiment where we gave people information about the compliance of others, but those treatments were very ineffective. Those have also been tried in earlier literature, and so I'm not going to focus on those too much. I'm going to think about the comparison between social and economic incentives for the bulk of the results. The data that we're using is linked administrative data, so this runs from 2008 till 2012. 2012 is the year of the field experiment, so we observe potentially the same individuals for up to 4 years pre-treatment. And so what we've done is combined the church tax records on individual payments year on year with the state personal income tax records, which, as I mentioned before, is the true tax base to understand the extent to which individuals are complying. So it's possible to define tax compliance in a very precise way relative to lots of income tax studies because we do observe the true tax base here. And as I said, we can define individuals on the basis of their pre-treatment behavior into these 3 heterogeneous types: baseline evaders, baseline compliers, and baseline donors. And the model predicts that there should be heterogeneous responses to the various types of treatment across this type distribution. In total, there's about 40,000 individuals who are involved in the field experiment. Okay, so what's our set of findings? So the first finding, it just looks at the control group, the individuals who receive the standard tax notification letter, to understand what might drive behavior in the baseline, absent any other experimental variations. So as I mentioned before, if deterrence is close to zero and individuals know that, then compliance is primarily driven by some form of social motivation here. So what do we find? Well, in the baseline setting, when people receive the normal tax notification, about 20% of individuals choose to make some payment, which is at least as great as the taxes that they actually owe. So we think about those individuals as being socially motivated on some margin, but about 80% of individuals choose to make a payment less than the true taxes that they owe, and about 90% of those 80% of individuals make a payment of zero. So what does this mean for the tax compliance puzzle? Well, if we take our standard Becker-Allingham-Sandmo model, it's about 80% right. It correctly predicts the behavior of all of those individuals who evade, but it's about 20% wrong. Remember, this is a setting of Germany where we think of people as typically having norms where people would adhere to their normal requirements. Here, what we're able to do is sort of move to a system of quasi-taxation or voluntary taxation, where we have low enforcement in a high norm setting, and we observe individuals moving to a Becker or Allingham-Sandmo type of behavior. That's true for 80% of individuals at baseline. Second key finding is that there seems to be a very sharp bunching of individuals at exact compliance in this baseline setting when individuals know that there's zero deterrence. Now, given that the probability of being audited is zero, there's no monetary discontinuity of exactly complying vis-a-vis just moving slightly away from that point. You can write down models where you would have discontinuities in your preferences for, driven by social motivations that may make you change your behavior exactly at exact compliance vis-a-vis other points of the distribution. We're going to label that a duty to comply, and one way we can try to measure that is by using standard sort of bunching techniques that have been used in the public finance literature. We're using this in a slightly different way than has often been used in that literature, in the sense that that literature normally has discontinuities in incentives and assumes preferences are smooth. Here we've got continuous incentives, and we're trying to identify discontinuity in preferences. So when you look at the data to measure the extent of that bunching, on the x-axis here, I've got the difference between the payments that you make and the payments that were owed. So you see a huge spike at zero, and estimating the bunching parameter, we observe about 7 times as many people there at that point than we would otherwise predict based on the density away from that point of exact compliance. So there's clearly something going on that even in the absence of any economic incentives, individuals are focusing on exactly complying, and that's what we refer to as a duty to comply effect. And there's multiple interpretations of that. One is that people just feel a sense of duty and they want to comply by the exact amount, and that's what's driving that spike there. So, the third finding then is trying to understand what happens when we move away from the standard tax letter and move away from the baseline that I've described. And so the first treatment that I want to talk about is one which simplifies this tax notification, makes the legal requirements more binding, and as well as making the tax brackets more prominent. And so all of the results have a similar structure. So this is the impact of the tax simplification letter vis-a-vis the control letter. This is when we pool our sample, and these are the heterogeneous effects depending on your pre-treatment behavior. So what we observe is that when the tax is simplified, individuals who were previously evading are much less likely to evade, and they contribute more. Their evasion rate falls once they understand how the tax is actually set up. There's no impact on behavior of those individuals who are donating. Individuals who are donating are not donating because they're confused. We don't see much change in their behavior. We see that some of the individuals who are evading at baseline were doing so because of the complexity of the tax system. When we then move to what's the impact of economic incentives, okay, by pooling together our deterrence treatments, what we see is by exogenously changing the probability that individuals are going to be audited, you find significant reductions in the probability of evasion amongst those who are evading beforehand, and they've significantly reduced their evasion rate. This group of individuals responds exactly in a very standard way that we'd expect to economic incentives. There's a little bit of movement amongst the baseline donors. Once those individuals know that there is going to be some penalty for evasion, one class of hypothesis would suggest that their good behavior is going to be crowded out. If anything, we find their behavior to be crowded in. They're more likely to donate when they know that there's a penalty for not complying. They may want to maintain the difference with other parts of the distribution. And the final result is just pulling together our various compliance rewards, where on the average individual, rewarding people for their good behavior doesn't have an impact, but the impacts are very heterogeneous across our two types of individuals. So rewarding individuals for their good behavior makes individuals who were previously evading evade to an even greater extent, and rewarding individuals for their good behavior has an opposite effect on those guys who are initially donating. It is possible for them to donate even more once there's the possibility of their good behavior being recognized either socially or through the entry into a monetary prize draw. Let me just wrap up with some conclusion. So here what we try to do is, in a similar setting, look at responsiveness to both economic and social incentives. The news for the sort of the standard Erlangen-Nürnberg model is somewhat good. I mean, 80% of individuals behave in a way that we'd expect according to that model, but this 20% of individuals don't. And so we'd really like, in future work, to get a better handle on exactly what's driving the motives of this 20%. About half of them are driven through the exact compliance that the individuals who I described as having a duty to comply. But we find very heterogeneous impacts of both economic and social incentives depending on your initial behavior pre-treatment. And so here what we're using is a particular context which is in between sort of standard tax settings that we're used to seeing and elements of charitable giving. But all imperfectly enforced tax systems have an element of this kind of voluntary give. And that may be of first order relevance when we're thinking about public finance in developing country settings. So it might be useful to try to extend further into these realms to really get a handle on the importance and nature of social incentives.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Imran. And now we have the third paper, which is going to be given by Michele Belot, and which will also be very interesting.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. Thanks to Sarah and Rachel for putting together this session. I'm going to present a paper that is in labor economics, but it has I guess, some direct link with the previous papers in the sense that we are trying to design and test a policy. It is joint work with Philipp Kircher and Paul Müller. So the broad context of this study and this paper, it is actually quite a big project that we have started now a year ago, where what we want to do is to study in a controlled manner how job seekers search for jobs. And for that, for doing that, we actually came up with a new methodology where we bring job seekers to search for jobs in our computer lab at the University of Edinburgh. And they basically will come for 12 weeks in a row for weekly sessions of about, well, between half an hour and 2 hours. And what we want to do is really to use this to study how they actually search for jobs using our search engine. And so we monitor their search activity in the lab, and we also, and this is the big advantage of this methodology in comparison to other methodologies, like, for example, getting access to data from online search websites, is that we can also ask survey questions directly and so know what other activities they might be doing in their week. So this is part of sort of the broad question that we are trying to address, is to how to improve job prospects. So there is actually a large set of interventions that have been done across developed countries, which aimed at increasing search effort. And mainly, actually, a lot of these interventions are somehow targeting economic incentives, whether it's punishment when you don't search harder, or actually rewarding you when you find a job. And it's not always very encouraging when you look at the evaluation of these policies. We find, well, generally we find relatively moderate effects of these policies. So there is a large literature in labor economics at the same time which tries to model job search behavior. But actually when you look at this literature, again, job search behavior is pretty much a black box. We don't really know how people really search for jobs. So we may know a little bit about channels, so for example, whether they ask their friends or whether they actually use things like online search engines and so on. We may know that they spend, how much time they spend in a week, which is always strikingly low actually. It is, I think, in time use surveys you find that people search, say, about half an hour a week. And we know, but we know actually very little about things like, for example, how broad do they search? Do they search beyond the area where they live? Do they look at different occupations than the one they are trained for? What kind of wage ranges do they consider and so on? And at the same time, so we know actually very little at the end of the day how to improve the effectiveness of job search. So this paper will be, the main goal of the study will be to design and test a low-cost intervention aimed at improving job search based on insights from discussions with field players and job seekers. And this I already mentioned, it's using a new methodology. Now, the proposed intervention that we want to test is, consists of providing information in a sort of automated manner. So what we want to do is something that is relatively low cost and we think actually should be relatively easy to implement, but that seems to be responding to some issues that at least we have heard both from the job seeker side and also from the advisors who are actually advising job seekers, who seem to think that actually it seems that people have, incentives to find a job, but at some point they don't really know where to search. What should they be looking for? So they've been, a pipe fitter for 15 years, and what kind of job should they be looking for? So of course advisors are trained to provide advice and to try to indicate and sort of direct people in certain ways, but it is indeed not so perhaps straightforward to actually provide such advice. At the same time, so in the UK and in other countries, occupational broadness, so meaning how broad do you look in terms of occupations, do you look at other occupations you have been trained for, is believed to be really important for job prospects. So in the UK, for example, job seekers are allowed to search narrowly for the initial 3 months, and after they have searched, they have to search widely, so they have to look at other things that they are sort of qualified for, or that they have been trained for or working in before. So what we thought is that actually labor economics and labor economists have a lot of data that can potentially inform this process, in a sense that we know, for example, from labor market transition statistics, where people like pipe fitters might be finding a job later on when they change jobs. So a lot of people, of course, stick to the same occupations, but other people sort of move to other occupations. And we thought, well, that might actually be quite nice and useful information to provide to job seekers. So of course, this is readily available labor market data. We're not inventing anything. But so what we thought is that maybe this is not really at their access, so they don't really have access to this data. Maybe the advisors don't have the time to really do this search like we have. So we thought maybe actually we can provide this, use this information to provide information to job seekers in a relatively low cost and automated manner. So it's a cheap, soft intervention, so suggestion instead of enforcement. And so if you will see that it has some elements of a nudge in a sense that there is no choice in the choice set and no change in the choice set. It's not that we are, say, limiting the possibilities that job seekers have. We have no change in the incentive structure. It's low cost, but it is actually a very sort of also standard policy sort of that doesn't require, say, to exploit behavioral anomalies in a sense, because it targets information friction. So if people have imperfect information, then that may actually be effective. If, of course, there is no informational friction, then this might not be effective at all. So the caveats, so I'm going to mention this because this is a new methodology, and we actually are hoping that we can roll this out in a sort of a broader setting. And so at this point, what I'm going to present is a study with a relatively small sample, so 300 job seekers. Also, you might worry about who these job seekers are, and so if I would have more time, I would tell you a little bit more about how representative they are. Also, in terms of outcome measures, we would like to know a lot about, what types of jobs did they find, whether they found a job, and so on. It is going to be relatively limited. The main outcome measure that I'm going to focus on, so beyond, say, how many searches they do, how many applications they make, and so on, is going to be whether they actually get interviews. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about job finding and also what types of jobs they find. You may also worry about general equilibrium effects. This is a general criticism that you can make to pretty much all these, experimental work that is done in a sort of a small scale, is that you never know when you roll this out on a broader scale whether indeed there might be general equilibrium effects such that, say, some job seekers, what the effects might be of such a policy is that some job seekers who participate to our experiment find the jobs, but it is taking the jobs of, say, other people who might have found a job or otherwise. So you want to sort of think about general equilibrium effects on a broader scale. And then the last thing that we won't be talking about, and we would like to be talking about in the future, is efficiency, of course, so whether indeed the types of jobs that they find are indeed good jobs. So the experimental design in a nutshell, so the experiment was conducted over 12 weeks in the computer facilities of the School of Economics at Edinburgh. We had two waves, so one in the fall of 2013 and the other in the spring of 2014. And they basically had to choose between different time slots on Mondays and Tuesdays, so 10 a.m., 1 p.m., and 3:30 p.m., and then they were asked to stick to that slot, so to come for 12 weeks at that particular point in time and use our search engine for at least 30 minutes and up to 2 hours. And the incentive was actually we give them some payment to participate, which was something that we actually discussed with the job centers before. It was compensating for their travel and for one meal, so we gave £11 per session. And we also gave them a £50 closing voucher for attending 4 consecutive sessions, so after week 4, week 8, and week 12. So of course they were encouraged to drop out when they found a job. Some did actually find a job, but it was a part-time job, and asked us whether they could continue. So we have a few cases like that, but most people, once they found a job, of course, drop out of the study. So what we did, and so the main intervention and the main experimental variation here, is to introduce a variation in search engines that they have used. So some people, half of the sample, will actually use what we call a standard interface all the way through. And this is something that is very similar to the type of job search interface that you may be familiar with. The other group will use a standard interface for 3 weeks, and then afterwards will be facing, or say, our new designed job search interface, which makes suggestions of what other things they could be looking at. And I'll show in a second what it looks like. Now, we randomized the group between the standard and the alternative interface, and we randomized at the time slot level, so meaning that if you were in a certain time slot, then you would be getting access to one interface or the other. Now, the standard interface, so as I said, it replicates features of popular job search engine. So this is what it looked like. So we redesigned basically the search interface because we wanted to, of course, keep track very precisely of how they search for jobs. We actually used the database that is the same database as the UK government website, so Universal Job Match. So we had access to a large number of vacancies. It is the biggest source of vacancies in the UK. So they could specify keywords, occupation, so they can actually use this, say, subcodes that we labor economists are familiar with. Then they can specify a location, then a salary, and whether they want a part-time job or not. Now, the alternative interface, what happens is that they first get a survey where they specify a preferred occupation. So they can say, well, actually, ideally, I would like to be a pipe fitter. Okay? And so based on that, we will make suggestions using two sources. One is using labor market transition statistics, where what we are going to tell you is basically most common occupations people transfer to from this preferred occupation. Okay? And the other is using a website that is a US website, which is called AllStarNet, where what they did is for each occupation, they try to give the most related occupations based on specific skills that you need for that occupation. And then what happens is we make these suggestions, and you don't have to follow them. You could actually unselect as many of these suggestions as you wanted. And we also have some geography suggestion. I'm not going to talk much about that because that was not effective. Not that I think that is actually perhaps, I don't think, it could be actually a promising policy as well, or a promising intervention, but what we have done at least didn't work very well. So in both cases, they always specify a radius of search, so they have a location and then they specify a radius of search. And they could also switch back to the standard interface. So this is where we really want to make it, here obvious that it is not something we force them to do. Okay, so this is what it looks like. So if you are, saying my preferred occupation is to be a waiter, so based on the labor market transitions, then you get a number of suggestions, which is, well, waiters and waitresses, sales and retail assistants, bar staff, chefs, cooks, retail cashiers and checkout operators, and then you have another set of suggestions based on the second methodology. And so they could click or unclick this. So the only element of nudge here is, if you are familiar with this literature, is that we clicked everything by default, so they might be indeed more sort of likely to stick to these suggestions because they are all clicked by default. It's not what we are testing at all here, but. So in terms of search outcomes, we're going to look at listed vacancies. So this is basically what you get when you, say, press a button search. You get a number of listed vacancies, and so I can look at how many do you actually get. And then when you click on a vacancy, you actually view this vacancy. So I'm going to look at the number of vacancies that you viewed. And then you can decide whether you want to save this vacancy or not to actually perhaps apply later. So that will be what I will call saved vacancies. And then you can always start a new search. Now, in terms of measure of occupational broadness, so I don't have time to go into the details here, but basically what we do is for each occupation you have a subcode that has 4 digits. And what we are going to do is to measure the distance between the occupations that you have. So I'm just going to look at, say, for example, your listings, and I look at, say, when I take 2 occupations at random, what is the average distance between these subcodes? The lower this distance, the smaller this distance, the more narrowly you are actually looking. In terms of descriptive statistics, we had 298 people who attended the first session. Participants attended 6.8 sessions on average, and 35% of the initial sample attended all 12 sessions. Now, the question, 2 questions. Did our intervention actually affect search broadness? So is it actually something that makes sense at all? And the second thing is, did we have any effect on job prospects? Okay, so what we do is a very simple sort of diff and diff analysis here, where I'm just going to look at the effects of the alternative interface on measures of broadness first, so this distance measure using diff and diff. We have things like time dummies, group dummies, and a bunch of observable characteristics of the people. But so basically what we want to know is whether this treatment had an effect on how broad you are searching. So I'm looking at how broad you are searching in terms of the listings that you get, in terms of the viewed vacancies, and in terms of the saved vacancies. Now it seems here with this table, it seems that you are indeed searching more broadly in terms of listings, but not so much in terms of what you're viewing and what you are saving. But of course, and this is what we realized very quickly on, also when you talk to focus groups, is that you have pretty much two types of people. You have people who actually search very broadly. They looked at everything. They don't even, put keywords. Sometimes they just look at all the vacancies that are available. And you have some people who search very narrowly. Okay, so we divided our sample according to this median, actually, measure of how broad you search into broad people and narrow people. And what we find is, of course, we find a difference, an asymmetric effect, is that the ones who are searching broadly, we actually make them search more focused and more narrowly. And the people who are searching narrowly in the first 3 weeks, I should say, actually then are searching more broadly with our treatment. Now, the second thing that we did, because when we talked to the focus groups, it's what came out really very much, is that they said, well, it's after a while, we don't know what to search for anymore. So we said, well, I've been a pipe fitter, I've been looking for 3 months now for pipe fitting jobs, I don't know what to search for. And so we thought it was interesting to distinguish between, say, long-term unemployed and short-term unemployed. So our long-term here is longer than 3 months. And what you see is pretty much the same pattern. So it doesn't matter whether you are short or long. If you were searching narrowly, you become more broad. And if you are broad, you become more narrow. Now, the second question is whether we actually affected job prospects. And I think I have 1 minute for that. So let me go to the results. What we find is sort of indeed mixed results depending on whether you are searching narrowly or broadly. So I want to focus straight away on the sort of the most important result, I guess, because these are the people who indeed came out of the focus groups and were saying, well, actually, we don't know what to look for. We've been searching for 3 months. And for them, we actually find an increase in the number of interviews that they get. We also, and you will see, I'm not going to hide that, we actually have a negative effect on the number of interviews that some people are getting. These are the people who have been searching actually quite broadly and are also long-term unemployed. For them, we don't seem to be affecting their job prospects in a positive manner. So what we say is that we have this very simple manipulation of search engine, which can actually affect how broad people search for jobs in terms of their occupation. Searching broader does affect job outcomes, so we see it on both sides. So if we indeed make people more narrow, then they actually get less interviews. And if we make people broader while they were narrow before, they get more interviews. But for us, it seems that it is actually a cheap intervention which can be effective if targeted to long-term unemployed. And so we sort of think it might be actually worthwhile to try to roll this out on a broader scale. Thank you very much.
So we now have two discussants. So I'll hand over to the first discussant, who's Michael Sanders, who's going to discuss all three papers.
Yeah, I'm going to not even try with the technology. So I just want to begin by saying it's really nice to have been invited here to speak, and particularly to discuss 3 papers by professors who, if I had to list the 3 professors who have had the biggest impact on my career so far, it would actually be these 3, which is kind of nice for me, although also slightly terrifying for the next 9.5 minutes. So I wanted to start sort of very, very broad and talk about sort of why do we care about behavioral economics and public policy. And so this is a picture of Dan Ariely, and the other guy is supposed to be sort of your archetypal classical economist. And Dan is here being the behavioral guy. He's like, well, the crash has happened, economics is wrong, now we need something new and better. And I don't personally buy that, so I'm not a behavioral economist, I like to tell people. It could be that the reason governments are really interested in it is because we're super cool. So your red graph is Google searches for behavioral economics with no U, and the blue graph is for behavioral economics with you. So this is basically allows us to, by accident of language, disentangle how interested Americans are in behavioral economics compared to the rest of the civilized English-speaking world. And so it looks like we're getting much more popular over time as behavioral economists. I did have another graph which I've cut from this for fear of being laughed at too much. which actually had, over the same time period, searches for Taylor Swift compared to behavioral economics, and we don't actually show up at all. So while we are getting cooler, it's from a fairly low base. For those of you who don't know who Taylor Swift is, ask your children. The third reason, which I think is possibly the most compelling, is this letter from Liam Byrne, then Chief Secretary of Treasury, to his successor, who was David Laws, for 17 days, in which he basically said, welcome to government, by the way, there's no money left. And so, because governments don't have very much money anymore, they sort of turn to new tools. And so governments, historically, as you all know, have got three tools. One is to just ban a bunch of stuff, to regulate, so we can do this, we can't do that. The other is to sort of use incentives, which kind of played quite a prominent role so far, pay people to do stuff, people not to do stuff, or tax them. Or to provide them with information, to just say, how about not smoking, it's really bad for you, you're going to die. Stuff like that. And so what governments are looking for is not a replacement for these tools, but a supplement for them. And because I do behavioral science for a living, I say behavioral science rather than behavioral economics, and also because it's me, I get to put the head bigger than the other three. Not because I think they're more important, but this is the topic of this conversation. So that's sort of why we think it's important. And I now get to plug myself a little bit here, because Sarah said I could for 2 minutes, so I will. In 2010, the government, which is this government for another 50 minutes or so before it ceases to be this government anymore, set up a team in government to basically apply behavioral economics to public policy. That's where I work, behind that door somewhere. And the fact that we're cool or not cool, I think, is really evidenced by the initial press coverage, which is universally negative, and was gradually replaced by slightly more positive coverage. And this isn't just one team set up by David Cameron, who may be a bit of a lunatic. It's now, across the UK government, so we now have 9 or so behavioral insights teams of various flavors, and those are sort of increasingly across the world as well. So this is increasingly popular and being applied to a broader and broader range of policy problems. We're also, given the fact there's no money left, people like us to be more experimental, to actually have good evidence to back it up, which is why I don't think that economics is about to be replaced as a discipline. So this is the number of experiments run in these countries which are applying behavioral economics and psychology to public policy. This is an underestimate because this is just the ones that come across my desk. I assume there are other people out there running these things. And so, just to get back to the topic at hand, we have sort of this new tool that we can use, that we can apply in the place of, well, not to replace, but to supplement existing things. And so we've had 3 talks so far which sort of look at these sort of the way in which these can be applied. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them. So Michele's paper, which I really obviously like very much because I think Michele's fantastic. It's very difficult to criticize when, as I said, these people are the people who've basically trained me. So I think, as sort of Michele was saying, she's been able to control the way people can search for jobs and help to manipulate that. And one of the things, speaking for colleagues at DWP, I think they've answered that if only they could do that, they would really love to be able to do this sort of thing. And it's a great thing to see you having manipulated universal job match, which I think many people on my team who've actually been conducting experiments with it in the last 6 months would have loved it to be slightly less rubbish. There is a sort of interesting sort of question around the extent to which we can actually say what we're doing here in terms of the outcome measures. Obviously, we want people to not just get interviews, but to get jobs, and then what kind of interviews and what kind of jobs that they're getting. So we have this sort of, if people start off much too ambitious, which a lot of the behavioral literature tells us everyone's going to go for the best job they can think they can possibly get and adjust downwards. To the extent that we're adjusting, we might be adjusting them downwards, which means they may be getting worse jobs faster and then maybe never recover. It could be we're making them actually much more ambitious and that we're never going to get jobs if they go down this route, or they're less likely to get jobs. So that's sort of, yeah, I guess that's it. The other thing you sort of touched on geography. So we have a study that doesn't really conclude anything either around the effect of getting people to think more broadly geographically in terms of things. So I think that's why I would really love to see more work on sort of moving forward, both us and everybody else. I also think, given the fact that your program seems to work for people who have a long-term unemployed and haven't really been searching, you could almost set yourself up as a work program provider for people who've been unemployed for a year and just have DWP pay to send you people to take part in your experiments, which would give you a lab of enormous magnitude. So that's sort of thoughts on that again. So in Imran's paper, so there's a lot of so Sarah said at the beginning, not too pointedly, I don't think, a lot of the evidence we have so far is small scale about the workings of these things, and lots of it comes from labs in which we experiment on female American undergraduate students in psychology who may not be completely representative of everybody in the entire world. And a lot of so there's some evidence from there which shows that extrinsic motivation crowds out our intrinsic motivation. So, and there's a lot of conversations you see in government where people say, oh, we can't do this because if we fine people for doing this, people who are doing it out of the goodness of their heart will stop doing it now and we'll have a much worse compliance issue. It's actually really interesting to see an area where that doesn't actually happen. Again, and also this idea that there are nice people and not nice people. HMRC really wishes it could tell who was who so they could treat them differently. I'm not sure from a sort of scalability point of view whether or not HMRC would consider getting rid of all enforcement. I think they probably still tell everybody that they've got rid of all enforcement. But we've got £12 billion of cuts coming up, so maybe we will do. Well, maybe not, who knows? Election coming up. The other the one thing which is I was slightly more skeptical about, I guess, is to read across between charity and taxation in this case. So while everyone in this country loves the NHS, I'm not sure that we feel the same way about HMRC as we feel about God. And so I think I'm more likely to engage in donated behaviour to churches than to tax, would be my sort of question about the generalisability. So Sarah, I put Sarah last because she's the one who says that behavioural economics doesn't really work in this context. So it's said that a lot of the evidence on this kind of effect is very small scale. And what we're seeing as we roll it out more and more, and a lot of work by Christina Roberto at Harvard School of Public Health, and Leif Nelson, was the more this kind of intervention, which seems to work quite reliably in the lab, we really just aren't getting any traction on it in the real world. And so either we have to go back to the drawing board and say these labeling effects don't really exist, or we need to sort of say, actually, we need to reformulate them and think of a new model. It's interesting that you thought that one of the possible explanations was that the people at your inframarginal individuals are less likely to be nudged than sort of the general population. The populations you're dealing with are, based on our data certainly, the people who are easiest to nudge, inverted commas. So that's sort of, so I think it's interesting that we're seeing so much stuff. Obviously, I would have liked it if it had worked, but for me, it doesn't seem like a labeling effect. It also feels like mental accounting more than that. But anyway, so just to quickly summarize, behavioral economics is it's definitely a complement rather than a substitute. We can't have a healthy start vouchers scheme that is only a nudge. There has to be the financial incentive. You can't have a tax compliance system that doesn't contain any kind of financial incentives. It needs to have the sort of complementary role. And that's sort of that again. And in many cases, and so thinking most about Imran's study here, is we're deepening our understanding of things which we already have, as well as working out exactly how to manipulate and change them. We're actually getting a broader understanding of why the world is behaving as it is. And just as Sarah said, it's not a silver bullet. We haven't solved all of our problems with this, and we're not going to solve all our problems with it. And so we really need to continue testing and testing and testing, which I think everyone here is doing anyway. So that's me.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And so now we have the final discussion, bundle, and then we'll have a few minutes for a demo.
Thank you. Great. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Sarah. 3 terrific papers. A lot of work, but this isn't work, of course. This is fun. I had to skip the Sunday papers for 3 much better papers. These are great examples using, following up on what Michael said, really. They're using real choices, using representative samples at a point where actual decisions are taken. You know, this is almost like getting like real science, and quite refreshing. Not just focus groups or non-random student lab participants, and I've had enough of those papers. So, oh, by the way, I don't have to worry about criticizing the authors. I don't suffer from the same problem that Michael did, but I'm not, because they're great papers. These are great research designs. They've got panel data in every case, actually, and linked histories, which means you can be precise about what you're conditioning in the baseline, and that's always been a problem with many standard interventions, either in the lab or often in the field. I appreciate that a lot. They're pragmatic too, as Michael said. They're really just trying to figure out what bits of real incentives and what bits of behavioral items might work. And I particularly like the fact that they're allowing a lot of heterogeneity. We're getting kind of different types here. And that may be the thing that is most important here. They examine behavioral policies, and they are kind of nicely designed, each one of them. I rather like the way they work together. In fact, there's a kind of incentive to do something that's rather standard in standard incentive theory, but then a behavioural bit added on. So we've got not just the increase in food, but increase in healthy food labelling. Not just reduce tax evasion, but exploit warm glow by publishing the name, for example. And not just increase search, but analyse the breadth of search. And of course, in each of these, as again, the first discussant was saying, it's very attractive to governments. You know, you're getting something for free. And I think generally economists are much more sceptical of anything that's free. And I think it comes out very nicely here. There's something going on, but it needs refinement. They're very well-defined target populations, but also designed well to get at unintended effects, rather like the things above. So we could have just looked at the group that the behavioural guys want to look at, but of course each one of these is very nice because it's saying, there's a big subpopulation here, bigger subpopulation, and things might go the other way for them. So we've got inframarginal consumers. They're not the distorted ones, they're the ones where there might be some dead weight, and we're finding dead weight. Overpayers of tax, the donors, that's an interesting group. They're not evading, they're doing exactly the opposite. How are they going to behave if we introduce this policy? And job search amongst those, there's already people doing the wide job search. What happens if we introduce this targeting? I really like this feature, and each one of these had that rather nice perspective. So terrific designs. Then I've got a slide on each one, which I won't spend all the time on, but this is a nice little triple difference approach, and it's very nice using the Cantor panel. This is the Sarah paper with Rachel and others. It's got the selection of low-income pregnant mothers, so using the data to kind of really look at a target group, and for each household or person really, you've got the measurement of history, and you've also got the very nice thing about Cantor, you can do quantity and expenditure. That's got some attractions here, actually. And in fact, of course, I know from other research they've done, they've looked much more carefully about, you know, the type of quantity, the type of food, and that's terrific. Of course, you know, by using, let's say, a representative sample along with an intervention, one of the real problems with this is that the overlap is narrow, and you get a fairly small sample, inevitably. And that's one of the things we always have to suffer if we're trying to use some experiment within a standard sample. It's but very neatly using the panel to define distorted, non-distorted groups. I think this is very nice. As far as I can tell with food stamps, now called SNAP, as Sarah said, most of the food stamp amounts is below what any family would be spending. And when I saw the amount here, I thought, well, this is going to be true for everybody. Surely people spend more than this on fruit and vegetables, but they don't, which is pretty shocking. And so there is a group that are distorted, and that's unusual as far as I remember in SNAP and that, you know, because it's the total food budget, it's usually well below the food budget, and this is a bit of an innovation of this thing. And they find that, you know, everything's driven by the distorted group. The voucher acts as a labeling on the non-distorted group. That's the other great thing about this experiment, because you wouldn't know just looking at the distorted group, but you can look at the labeling effect in the non-distorted group where it's a pure labeling, or they suggest it's a pure labeling. There should be a kind of income effect too, but perhaps it's small enough not to matter. The large dead weight, that's a bit of a loaded term. After all, it really depends. We don't really worry about average dead weight, or maybe we should. Depends how you think about it. But as a dead weight, to me, I typically have a social welfare weight. I expect it's absolutely fine. But if we were putting all the weight on children in their first 2 years, then I wouldn't put any weight on the other guys. So I think when I think about dead weight, I think about welfare, and I need a social welfare weight there. It's a small point. Triple difference, it's got a very nice feature for, you know, us statistical nerds. They've done a great job of getting around the mean reversion point, because one thing you might say is you're going to select people who are not distorted or distorted in the previous period. Then you've always got the problem they were temporarily in that position. Then they jump back and you get what we typically in labour experiments call Ashenfelder's dip that you're selecting on the transitory shock. They take the average before. Another great thing about having this long baseline is you can do that. Imran does the same, actually. It's a very attractive feature. Small, couple of small points. One is the policy is very similar to this before. And I think you mentioned this, but one comment. So you're getting a net effect of a policy, not really just the policy. Secondly, there is, in the MPC, you've got the income on the right-hand side, which is total groceries, which of course includes the voucher effect. I realize that's very small now, so maybe it doesn't matter. But you talk about that being a net effect, but there would be a pure endogeneity effect, obviously. If there's a shock to the regression, there's also a shock to income, and that's the standard upward bias effect. So that's a small thing there. Tax compliance, I love this thing because of the number of treatments. It always annoys me when people run experiments, they just do one thing. Imran and his colleagues look at 12 treatments. Fantastic, because you can begin to do real economics now, because you can vary the treatment around to try and learn about the structure of behavior rather than just one particular policy. There are a couple of small points, families or individuals. I couldn't quite figure that out. And I didn't know whether the model is an individual model, a family model, and are they stable? You know, people become individual households. I mean, in the tax terms, because Germany has joint taxation. So if you're a couple, then you're in the joint. If you're single, you're not. And that must have something to do with it. I worried about spillovers. In fact, I worry about this in every single one of these papers now, in more and more. But here we've got the whole subpopulation, and we're treating one group. And we're talking about social preferences. This seems even more important than standard G effects, that the control groups could get contaminated by knowledge that this thing is out there. So if you tell one group that, you know, we're going to make the simplification, by the way, is to tell them they can be caught out. And in fact, they're going to increase the probability of that. Well, if your neighbor happens to be the randomized in, and they tell you, hey, look, do you know this is what's going to happen? And we kind of worry about that more in a social preferences behavioral world, and it worries me a lot generally about whether we can really do randomized controlled trials in behavioral economics when we worry about social preferences. And that's a kind of common comment. It wouldn't affect Sarah's paper, of course, because the people are drawn from all over the place. But when you're drawing for everyone in a neighborhood, which looks very attractive, 40,000, you're going to have neighbors. And that's like the equivalent of the G problem, isn't it? The other thing is that, you know, overpayment or measurement. These are very small amounts, as Imran pointed out. It's €5. It's probably for most people about 25 euros a year. What I was looking for, but I didn't see it, do they change the level? Then you could really look at when they change the level from 25 to 30. Do they change behavior? Or do people get focused in on one level and they just pay their 10 euros every year, which is why they're bunching? I mean, there's a number of things going on there, but generally it's a great paper. And I really liked this other point that they are able, we often worry about whether people understand the system. At least here it looks like they really do understand, because among those that are evading, if you tell them what's going on, they kind of understand what's going on. So it's people do understand the system, and you know, there's very nice things here. Got lots to say, but then effective search. I like this again. You know, realistic setting. Do they search? So one problem I had is we don't know much about what else they're doing, and I'm still not quite sure about that. So do you crowd out other search? But you might have said that in the last slide. So do we know where? Does it matter? Perhaps you've covered that. But the treatment, as you pointed out, is not really the new search engine. It's actually an intention to treat where they're allowed to choose either one. And so, in a sense, like all intention to treat, we don't know the effect of the policy. We know the effect of having the option of the policy. If it was rolled out, you presumably wouldn't have the option so much. And if they choose this alternative, they're allowed to go back to the other. And that can dull the effect, as in all intention to treat. And it's, I think that's worth thinking about too. And should we think of it as geographic? I think Michael mentioned that. I was a bit lost as to whether the broadening is geographic or occupational. And they seem very different to me. Do people just search in their neighborhood or with a set of among a set of friends, or are they limited by their occupation? And but you have this great, again, using the baseline history to get this non-broad and already broad searches. Fantastic, I thought that was good. And then this unintended effect that once you start targeting people, even the guys who are kind of doing a good thing now start targeting in the wrong direction. By the way, I've seen a lot of papers lately on financial literacy saying the same kind of thing. I think Doug Bernheim's got a set of behavioral experiments in Stanford where people respond to the kind of nudge of what to do, but the ones who are doing even better now do things much worse than they did, because, of course, the one thing you nudge isn't going to be the best option for everyone. And so you can cause some difficulties there. And he has a case where people really make a mess of their financial portfolio because of that. One small thing, econometric thing, just to add up on, to finish on, and that's selection. You said you don't look at people getting a job. I thought that would be the outcome of interest, whether they get a job or not. It turns out not many do. And in fact, the treatment doesn't really have much effect on whether they do. As far as I could tell, it has no significant effect in the sample of whether they get a job or not. So I had two questions. Well, if that's the case, is it really having, they might be broadening, but so far we haven't really got evidence they're getting a job. Perhaps we'd like to not just get a job, but what earnings they get on the job. But if it did have an effect, isn't that going to cause you problems of selection? Because the good ones go out, and then what the group you're looking at the end are not a randomized treatment comparison, control treatment comparison, like all things of this kind. You're getting selection, and of course, if the broadening is working good for the treatment group, they're going to be leaving in a selective way, and you won't be comparing like with like. And I don't know a good way of getting around that, actually. So I think if you do roll this out, that's going to be a key issue. And then the spillover effect, is this, the firms don't know what's going on here, I presume. If firms really knew all about this broadening of search, how would they respond? What would they do? What's the kind of, how would it roll out? But anyway, fantastic papers, and I've already used up all.
So we do have a couple minutes. If there's any burning questions, I could take one or two questions, and then I'd like to give the authors a minute to respond. Is there any? Yes. Sorry, can you just wait for the microphone? Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for a very interesting session. I have a quick question for you. And my question is that it's really coming from Richard's point that, this seems to be quite a close-knit community of Protestants who tend to attend similar churches. So, and I was really struck by your main finding that there is this bunching up of this payment, that is at point 0. So I was wondering, could there be a kind of peer effect happening here, right? So basically these people know each other, and it's a kind of social norm, social behavior. And is there a kind of ostracization or something, kind of punishment if someone doesn't stick to this kind of rule, the church rule, which is a kind of very soft law. So that's one thing I was thinking. And the other thing is that for those who are over-providing, the donors, do they have some kind of tax incentive for the income tax? Because in some countries, like in the UK, if you donate to some places, you have a tax exemption, and however little it might be. Could there be something of that sort? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other burning questions? No, so I'd like to just give the authors each a minute to respond to any of that if they would like. Do any of the authors want to? Go ahead. Yep. Sorry, could you give him one of the? Thank you.
So just quickly on the point about the spillovers, which came up in Richard's discussion and the question. So we were obviously concerned that people would talk about these things. But it's not the norm for people to talk about their tax notifications. But just to double check this, we set up a hotline where people could, if they had any queries, they could get back to us and ask us, what's going on here. And there were very few people who rang that hotline during the course of the experiment. So I think for another dimension, you could probably look at social spillovers. But the other thing I wanted to emphasize was that hardly anybody actually attends church in Germany. Attendance rates across the different parishes we have in our sample are between 0 and 5%. Even if you look at Christmas and Easter, there's a very small fraction of individuals attending. So most of these individuals, I mean, a very small group of them are religious, but the vast majority are quite similar to the average German. So we don't think the religiousness of the samples was driving some of the responsiveness.
So I just would like to very much thank Michael and Richard for the discussions, which were both very interesting and added a lot to the papers. So actually I just wanted to come back on the sort of deadweight cost issue, because it sort of comes up in both papers but in a slightly different way. I mean, absolutely, from a social welfare point of view, I completely agree. Any transfer payment is just a transfer of welfare from one group to another. But I think the main aim with focusing on deadweight cost and effectiveness goes back to part of the motivation for behavioural policies, which is, can they deliver the outcomes that governments want in a sort of more cost-effective way? So I think with the Healthy Start paper, what it was promising was to deliver increases in fruit and veg to a wider group, and so make the policy more cost-effective, even if from a social welfare point of view, it's not a deadweight cost, it's just a transfer. I completely agree with that point.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would also like to thank Richard and Michael for the really valuable comments. Just maybe two things I wanted to come back on. Yes, so indeed, the reason to do this thing in the lab rather than, say, using online data was to collect additional data on what they do elsewhere and what other things they do, what other interviews they might get through other strategies. So it's something we will lose if we roll this out on a broader scale and don't have a survey attached to it. So I very much hope we can keep both going. And regarding job finding and indeed what types of jobs, of course it's our dream to be able to have this. It is, I mean, so we hope that when we roll this out on a broader scale, we'll have more information. But at the moment, we were really uncomfortable with doing anything with this because the numbers are so small that I wouldn't be confident in saying whether there is any treatment effect or not. So it's true there is no significant effect right now, but I'm not sure I would conclude that this is the last word on this. Okay, thank you.
So I'd like to conclude by, first of all, thanking Sarah very much for the effort that she put into organising the session and to all the excellent speakers and discussants, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference.